Welcome to the Filmlinks Podcast,
a bi-weekly podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is episode 71, Detectives, Dames, and Deception.
Slant those blinds, fill your room up with smoke. It's time to talk about film noir.
Yes, this is a classic genre of film history that we have probably mentioned this genre so much on this podcast that we figured it was about time that we do a deep dive into it. And what better time than when it's getting to October and people are getting in the mood for some dark and mysterious films. So first of all, we should talk a little bit about the history of film noir, though, which the film noir genre was not actually recognized while it was actually happening, which was classically during the 40s and 50s is when these films were mostly coming out, but they were at the time considered melodramas. The term film noir was first applied by a French critic named Nino Frank, but it wasn't actually accepted in the industry until people started looking back on the era in the 70s. It has its origins, as we talked about in our German Expressionism episode, so you can go check that out. So German Expressionism comes over to America because World War II starts happening. Nazis are occupying Europe, and so a lot of these directors are immigrating to America, and they're bringing their stark, shadowy, and dramatic filmmaking techniques to America. And at the same time, in America, there is a kind of explosion in the hard-boiled detective kind of pulp novels. So you kind of combine those two together and you get the film noir genre, which is classically defined by a lot of elements such as a hard-boiled detective with some kind of ambiguous morality. There's usually a woman who's more or less treacherous, and lots of decisions that have varying degrees of moral ambiguity to them. And typically, the film Touch of Evil, which we will be covering today, is considered the last film of the classic noir period. And then it kind of goes on and has another life, obviously influencing films past that in the neo-noir genre, which we've touched on before, but maybe we'll have to do a deep dive on that a little bit later.
Yeah, and we totally picked Touch of Evil to be the last movie this week and the last film of the film noir period on purpose.
Definitely.
That was how that happened. Yes, it will be interesting to talk about a genre that wasn't so self-reflexive about its existence when it was, busy existing.
Happening, yeah.
Yeah. So maybe.
And it's funny because all the directors that we're talking about today, they didn't just do film noir. Like, this isn't a genre that people camped out in. It's just something that a lot of these old directors would kind of touch on, and then they would do a lot of different things, and they just happened to do really good films in this genre.
Yeah. And all of the directors we're going to talk about today are epic.
Yeah.
Like they are freaking up there in the ranks. And we're going to get to them right now as we kind of give you a brief preview of the films we talk about, which is a thing we do. The first one is The Maltese Falcon from 1941, based on a novel of the same name by Dashiell Hammett. It was directed by John Huston, who, is epic, and we've already talked about him before. This was, in fact, his first feature ever. And if you want to hear more about him on the podcast, before he gets his own episode, go see episode 63, in which we talk about The African Queen. And this movie was nominated for Best Picture, Best Supporting Actor for Sidney Greenstreet, and Best Screenplay.
Yeah, and then we move on to Double Indemnity from 1944, based on a novella of the same name by James Cain, directed by the epic Billy Wilder, who directed many of the classic film noirs.
I thought this was directed by William Wyler.
No, but there actually is a funny story in the AFI Convos book that we mention occasionally on the podcast, where he was invited to a screening somewhere and they started playing one of William Wyler's movies. instead because they didn't know which one he was.
I mean, it's an unfortunate set of names.
Yeah, at the same time. But this film kind of swept the Oscar nominations, although it did not actually win any. It was nominated for Best Picture, Best Actress, Best Director, Best Screenplay, Best Black and White Cinematography, Best Sound Recording, and Best Score.
Whew. Man, that's a lot of nominations to not win anything.
Right.
And then the final film we're going to talk about today is Touch of Evil from 1958, directed by Orson Welles. This film is based on the novel Batch of Evil by Whit Masterson. It is directed by Orson Welles, and if you want to hear more about him, we do have an episode entirely about him, episode 61 from earlier this year, Wunderkind Welles, and you can go hear all about some of his other films and his crazy, crazy life as a both director and a weird human being. And this was Welles' last film that he did for a Hollywood studio. The rest of his filmography would be done mostly as independent productions or in association with European studios.
Yeah, and we talked about that kind of rift in Hollywood in the episode 61, so go back and you'll get all the details. But for now, let's get into our movies.
The Maltese Falcon from 1941. In a classic film noir opening, we start in the offices of private detectives Samuel Spade and Miles Archer when they are approached by a Mrs. O'Shaughnessy, who pays to have her husband followed. Archer opts to go follow the man but is shot and killed. Spade, who realizes that the original job from Miss O'Shaughnessy was a ploy, is now thrown into a world of deceit and danger, where he encounters several criminals involved in the theft of a highly valuable and ancient artifact, the Maltese Falcon. He must decide who he can and cannot trust, and try to come out of the twisted affair with the upper hand.
All right, so this movie has, a classic film noir opening. They all kind of do in their own different way. This one, we start out in the Private Eye's office, and we're following the Private Eye throughout, and probably the most famous actor for playing Private Eye's Humphrey Bogart.
Yeah, right. He's got the perfect face, the perfect voice for being just this hard-boiled guy, and you're never sure, what side of this moral line he's on, especially in this film, because he bounces all over the freaking place. And he just takes... the most striking thing to me about the opening scene is just how well both detectives just take everything in stride right off the bat. And the gears are turning in their minds, but you don't see it. You just kind of understand it in the way that they're talking and the way that they're understanding. And everything from the get-go seems fishy. Everything feels like a lie in this movie.
Yeah, and it's interesting what I found through a lot of these films with the detectives and stuff is that there's so much trust that's up in the air. But whenever people are sitting down in the Private Eye's office, he makes them think that he's believing every single word that they're saying. And it's only later he's like, oh, yeah, no, I knew you were totally lying about that. And they're like, oh, I thought I totally had you. As the audience, we're believing them, too, because the character that we're made to sympathize with is also seemingly believing them.
Yeah. There's a lot to learn about how humans work and how to have, devious social interactions. There's a lot of leading people on and not just lying, but what am I saying? Manipulation. Should I have manipulation? The femme fatale in this movie, and we'll get into that concept in depth in this episode, is manipulating Bogart's character right off the bat. Everybody else he meets along the way is lying, or, even in the case of the actual police detectives he's interacting with, has alternate motives, alternate agendas. Nobody seems to just be fighting for the concept of good.
Yeah, and it's also interesting with the police in these stories because we're following the private detective who... his job entails a lot of the same actions as the police in some instances, especially once murder gets wrapped up into this within the first 5 minutes or whatever. But
he's not efficient killing of somebody who you think is going to be a main character.
Yeah, right. Whenever Archer's killed, we're like, whoa, wait a second, that was fast. We thought Archer was going to be like, one of the detectives following this case.
Yes, interesting event or incident that happens within the first 5 minutes of the movie to hook the audience into continuing to watch the story.
These terms may be familiar if you've been to sophomore English class.
The witch's hat, Jonathan. It's called the witch's hat.
Yeah. It's actually the little crook before the witch's hat actually starts. But yeah, I mean, also this is coming out of a very classical period in Hollywood. So, directors and writers are thinking in 3-act structures and that very, very structured kind of a story build. And yet they're able to throw so many curveballs at us throughout it, and mostly because it's about the way that the characters interact. It's not really about the mystery, or in this case, we have a huge MacGuffin, which we haven't got to talk about in a little while, so that's fun.
Not
the
just
Maltese
a MacGuffin,
Falcon.
A Maltese MacGuffin.
Yeah, the Maltese MacGuffin. Yeah, so we're following these characters who are trying to get back this bird or whatever with a bunch of jewels on it. We don't care. We were like, okay, that's great. They had it in the Crusades or something.
Perfectly describes its importance.
Yeah, there you go. But it's about the characters. It's about how Humphrey Bogart interacts with the woman. It's about how Humphrey Bogart interacts with the what's his name, Gutman or whatever, the big boss guy, and how confident he is.
Gutman. I get it.
Yeah, Gutman. It's even more about the way that Humphrey Bogart can disarm people than it is about the bird. I must say, he impressively disarms many people in this movie.
Oh, yeah. I mean, he has everyone played right up until...
He doesn't use guns. I was thinking about you, Alex, because there are a lot of guns in these movies, but I feel like all these noir films use guns in really interesting ways. So, for example, in this one,
because
Humphrey Bogart always takes a gun from someone else who seems to have the advantage over him.
Yeah, everybody keeps pulling guns on him. It's almost becomes like a trope within the span of 30 minutes, and it's really funny and amusing. And the interesting part about the guns in these movies isn't the way they're used, because they're hardly ever used, if ever. It's in their threat, and they're just tension.
It's a power
tools,
thing,
and it's a power dynamic thing, which is great. It's a great way to use a weapon. And then if one does happen to go off, woo, suddenly you relieve the tension, and we've talked endlessly about building and relieving tension, but I do want to talk about the concept of power plays, because the first time I watched this movie, I was 16 years old. I didn't know anything, but now looking at it, I realized they don't go to a whole lot of locations. This is a very, very condensed movie, almost entirely on sets. I feel like a lot of it, if not most of it, takes place in Humphrey Bogart's apartment. I mean, there's an entire scene that lasts like near to 30 minutes towards the end of the film that all takes place in one location. So it almost has like this chamber piece-esque quality to it that just relies on these characters manipulating each other and interacting with each other. And to that degree, in terms of just like echoing like a chamber piece on the stage, like it's written very well.
Because even like the action stuff happens in his office when the guy comes in with the bird, or in the other apartment or whatever. Like there's not a lot of going outside and like long chase scenes or anything, but it's still super exciting.
Yeah. It's all just about manipulation back and forth. And again, to that MacGuffin point, it's not about what the MacGuffin is, because the MacGuffin is just this dumb bird. It's about what that MacGuffin drives these characters to do and what it reveals about them. And that's kind of the whole film noir genre to a certain extent. I mean, sometimes the plot can be really interesting, but we always know it's going to be crazy going into a film noir. We're always going to know people are going to do dumb stuff and dark stuff and mean stuff and morally ambiguous stuff. We know that's going to happen. But the interest is in seeing, exploring this darker side of humanity and seeing these really interesting, complex, sometimes just kind of like two-dimensional stereotypes interact with each other in this dark world that we don't get in your typical dramas of this Hollywood period.
Yeah, and one of those power dynamics that I kind of want to dig into in this movie in particular, because it really struck me the way that the scene is built, is a point near the end when everything's kind of come to a head. All the bad guys have been like trying to get the jump on Humphrey Bogart, but he keeps staying ahead of them basically, and they're all like trying to come to a decision, and Bogart starts just like pinning it on this guy who's been
his punching bag the entire movie.
Yeah, basically this guy who's been following him around, and like he's the henchman kind of a character, and so everyone starts pointing fingers at him, and they're like, we're gonna just use him as the fall guy, like just say that he did all the bad stuff, and then they'll get someone to arrest, and we'll all be fine. And you start to feel really bad for this guy as we get put a little bit in his place. I mean, he has kind of a sad sack face in the first place. And then the point where he was knocked out and then he wakes up and everyone is just staring at him and leaning over him. And it's this really interesting thing where it's like he's just kind of another character, but by making everyone who's done much worse stuff gang up on him, we have sympathy for him now too.
Yeah, no, the entire power dynamic shifting over the course of the film isn't just power dynamic shifting between the characters. It's power dynamic shifting the sympathy that the audience has for the characters, which, you know, if nothing else in this movie kind of gives you a hint at how good of a director John Huston's going to become.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sure, you know, if this is 1941, hot takes, Alex, would be all like, yeah, man, watch out for this John Huston character. He's going to do some crazy stuff. And, you know, he'd be right.
Yeah. And I think that shifting of sympathies is most clearly and universally seen in the character of the femme fatale. So we start off with this woman who comes in and she's like, I'm so worried about my husband. I need you to follow him and see what he's up to.
Bullshit.
Right. But at first we're like, oh, okay, so she's got something going on with her husband. Then we realize there is no husband, and whatever, like literally everything that she said was a lie, except that she wanted this one specific guy followed. And it just keeps going back and forth. And then even after, and this happens all the time, even after Humphrey Bogart finds out that she lied to him, she tries to, she plays up the sex angle, and she's like, oh, but I you know, I only did it for you, you know, you've changed me, I'm different now. And Humphrey Bogart's just not having it. But this is a classic tactic that film noir does, and it's one of those human dynamics that women have this this power over men to get them to do things, and that manipulation is a huge element in making these films work. Less so in Touch of Evil, and we'll see in that film how you could kind of put a twist on it by not having the woman be the manipulator. Yeah,
and you know, of course, the whole thing is probably a reflection of some of the screwed up gender dynamics that were happening in 1941 America, but dang, does it make for some interesting movies. Also, I wanted to ask you this, Jonathan. Spade. That's an interesting name.
Yeah, it is.
Do you think it has anything to do with the saying "call a spade a spade"?
I don't know. I didn't think about it too much.
Which means to call something as it is.
Yeah.
But to call Sam Spade as he is, I don't know what Sam Spade is until the very end of the movie.
Well, I mean, you could think of it the other way, where he's the one who has to call a spade by seeing through the deception and manipulation of the woman, and the other bad guys too, because they try to suck up to him too at some point once they realize that they can't just brute force overcome him.
Yeah, right. It's
So I think it's more about his his role as cutting through all the bullcrap of everything else that's going on
with his spade.
Yeah, I was gonna say that too. It's like he's digging into these mysteries.
Yeah.
Then the question is, Archer doesn't live up to his name very well.
No. You think
Unless
this
he's
guy
just
would
the
be
target.
a sure shot? Nope. Not
He's
at
a
all.
misfire.
He got set up. But misfire is a weird last name to have.
Yeah, it is.
It is. But anyway, yes, all those decisions were definitely made while writing the book. But it's a very for like what I am led to believe was a pulp novel from the mid-century. That seems really like a really well-written pulp novel.
Yeah, I imagine it's kind of pulpy because there's just kind of this influx of those types of novels, which you can see by how many film noirs there are that have a lot of these similar elements. So I want to talk a little bit about the ending here, so I'm going to put down a spoiler warning for a second. So Alex, I want to talk to you about what you think Sam Spade's motivations are, because throughout we're kind of given to believe that he can be pretty well influenced by money. There are a lot of bribes thrown around, and he likes to take them and he likes to weigh them and consider how much money is being given away. From the very beginning, when she gives him $20 or something, which he thinks, or $200 or something, which he thinks is a lot. And then that number goes up and up and up as we get into the value of the Falcon and all that kind of stuff. But at the end, he gives the money back to the cops and he gives everything up. And it makes you realize that, oh, maybe he's been doing this. He's been playing this straight the whole time. And he's only been using these bribes and stuff to play the game of the bad guys. And he doesn't actually care about it.
Yeah, so I do think he cares about the money. I do think he has some of those tendencies, some of those darker tendencies in him. But I think those darker tendencies are a lesser part of him, and I think it's part of what makes him a good detective. To catch a criminal, you need to be able to think like a criminal, right? And that probably means you have some criminalistic tendencies.
I think another thing is that by the end of the whole shenanigans, he just kind of is washing his hands of it, and that's what I was kind of waffling between. Is he just like getting rid of everything that connects him to this because he's so done with it and emotionally wasted, or is it because he actually has a moral standard and he knew, like, he's just been playing all these bribes and stuff just to stay in the game?
Yeah, right. It's I think this is like the hottest water he's ever been in, and by the end he's in, if not full, next to full self-preservation mode, trying to keep it all together.
Yeah, but it is interesting that of the three, this detective is, like, by the end, that last decision where he does give up the money and tells the cops everything that happened as it happened, is one of the most kind of straightforward endings, where it's like, okay, so he did the right thing and everyone got their comeuppance, kind of a deal. But you got to imagine that he's got, some emotional baggage from the seduction of the woman, and he's got just like, so he's had guns pulled on him so many times in the last week that he's just like, get it all away from me.
Yeah, right. Like, he just wants a nap. It definitely feels to me like by the end of this movie, this is a man who just wants a nap, and nobody's pointing a gun at him. Nobody's starting to kill him. Just
no one's drugging him.
Yeah. It's just all out of his life. And he gets that at the end. Good for him.
Yeah. And I guess we should just mention real fast, because we've seen Peter Lorre several times on this podcast, that we get another Peter Lorre performance.
Yeah.
He does a great job of the kind of furtive, kind of scattered bad guy who's just trying to keep up with things and keep his neck off the cinder block.
Yeah. For some reason, I remember him playing a larger role in this film than he does. I mean, he does play a large role, but he's not like the main bad guy.
Yeah, no, it's not big, but he's always memorable in everything that he's in.
Yes, he is. All right, shall we talk about Double Indemnity?
Let's do it.
Double Indemnity from 1944. This film starts with the protagonist, Mr. Walter Neff, stumbling into the office of an insurance firm and beginning to record what he calls a confession for his coworker, Barton Keyes, into a dictaphone. The rest of the story is told in flashback, with brief interjections of voiceover from this recording throughout. We follow Walter Neff as he comes to the house of Mrs. Phyllis Dietrichson to renew her husband's car insurance policy. During this first interaction, Neff quickly falls in love with Phyllis, and over the course of several meetings, she involves him in a plot to kill her husband and collect accident insurance on him, specifically involving a double indemnity clause. After they put their plan into action, tensions rise when Keyes starts to have suspicions about the accident, and Walter starts to have suspicions of Phyllis's true loyalties.
All right, so the opening of this film, again, is another really classic film noir technique, and one that carries throughout the whole film, which is the voiceover. And this is something that is used very often, even in Billy Wilder's films, like his other famous noir, Sunset Boulevard, which has a very famous voiceover because it's used so uniquely. But in this one, it's used to kind of just set up the mystery. So we already kind of know where we're going, and we just get to follow the story. So there's a quote from Alfred Hitchcock where he says that rather than a whodunit, the story is a when's he gonna do it. And so that's pretty much exactly what this is, because as he walks in bleeding, we know the first thing he says is that I killed the guy, and the second thing is because I was it was like this woman's basically master plan, and then we get to see all the steps of that plan. And it's super exciting because we know that it's going to end badly. We know that the guy's going to die. We just get to see when's it going to happen, how's it going to happen, and which is perfect for you, Alex, because I know you're not big on movies with like big spoiler endings because you just like watching the journey. Here, Billy Wilder doesn't let it be a spoiler. He's like, I'm just going to tell you what's going to happen, and then you're just going to watch it happen.
Oh yeah, this is a phenomenally well-structured movie. You could set your freaking clock to when like the plot points happen in this movie. Like right at the halfway point is when the murder actually happens, and they think they've gotten away with it. Then everything starts to go wrong, and
there's a lot that happens after the actual murder.
Oh yeah, and then Edward G. Robinson starts to close in on them, which is like one of the funnest parts of the whole movie. This is an interesting.
Edward G. Robinson plays the main character, insurance agent's coworker who picks up on the trail. Who's
like the moral core of this movie, and that's so weird because I only know him from playing mobsters.
Yeah,
right.
But he does such a good job.
Right, he is the original Scarface or Little Caesar, one of the two, maybe both. And then, of course, the other movie I always think of him from is Key Largo, with which is actually a John Huston movie, where he plays another mobster. But in this one, he's like the moralistic core of the whole thing. And then meanwhile, our protagonist, who, maybe in 1944 doesn't come across this way, but hopefully he did. There's something wrong with this guy. Like, nobody says yes to what he says yes to. He is messed up from the get-go. And the motives that she gives him for wanting to kill her husband are not strong enough in their own right for him to come across as any sort of moral good at the top of this film. He kind of comes back on it and has a moral reawakening, or maybe he's just scared for his own skin later in the film. But, early on, he's definitely just doing it out of selfish intent. He wants the girl, he wants the money. There's no bright silver lining to what he's doing at the top of this thing.
Yeah, and I mean, Billy Wilder sets up the lust angle from, the very first frame once we go into that flashback, and he opens the door and she's there in her in a towel, basically, and he's looking up at her through the staircase, and he talks about it in the voiceover. And this is one of the really interesting things about this movie, is that this kind of like this seduction kind of a thing is a huge part of Double Indemnity. And it's really interesting because it's a big part in a lot of these film noirs, and yet they had to play it very kind of coyly because we're still in the Hays Code. So although the seduction and sex is a huge element of the motivations in this film, it has to be done very implicitly throughout the film.
Yeah, it gives it like this broiling right under the surface quality to it, though, that I feel like really makes this thing pop.
Yeah.
Because question, Jonathan, in the second half of the movie, where this guy starts to switch sides on the femme fatale and starts hanging out with the daughter, do you think he gets with the daughter?
I don't think so, because I think there would have been a change in the daughter that we'd have noticed, because she's still all for this other guy. I think he just plays it. He might have fallen for her in his mind, but I think he doesn't play it that way. Otherwise, there would have been a change in her, because she's basically the only pure character that is in this movie, even though she kind of sneaks out with this guy.
Yeah, but that's just kid stuff.
Yeah, but I think we'd have seen a darker side to her if that was happening.
Yeah. In which case, I'm glad she escaped.
Yeah, she's kind of the only one that gets out of it. Okay.
Yeah. And she doesn't. It's not like she doesn't come away with scars. She loses both of her parents over the course of the movie, but one of them before the movie starts. But
Yeah, that's another interesting thing is, and we're gonna like tiptoeing around spoilers, so you should probably watch all these movies before you listen to our podcast on it. Now that I say that halfway through.
Jonathan, but that's every week. Why do we?
I know.
Why do we even bother? It's every week.
We should just put the spoiler alert just like on the blog, like on the top of the blog.
Yeah.
But one of the interesting things is how much extra information starts getting thrown in there, like over halfway through. Like, oh, we had no idea that the mom might have been murdered until halfway through. We had no idea that the daughter's boyfriend has been hanging out with the mom until over halfway through. And so as much twists and turns there are at the beginning just to get this guy killed, it starts getting even twistier afterwards, and things just start unraveling and getting more complicated, like at the very end of the movie.
Yeah, right. Like the power plays, they're less upfront than in the Maltese Falcon, partially because we're moving through so many discrete locations, and everybody is a little separate from each other, and they only interact in like ones, twos, or threes at a time. You don't have a big chamber piece scene with everybody in it. But the power plays still happen, and the tension building is fantastic, and some of the scenes where the power is happening just pretty much straight up through blocking is utterly brilliant. There's a scene where just after the murder, where the femme fatale is going up to the insurance agent's apartment. Notice I know none of these people's names, but right as she calls to say she's coming up, his boss, the insurance investigator, knocks on his door, and suddenly they're having a talk about all of the things that couldn't have happened. Like, oh man, there's no way it could have been suicide. I think it was murder. I think it was that woman who killed her husband. Meanwhile, she's outside the door, presumably this entire time, just waiting. And then as the guy opens up the door to let his boss out, she's hiding behind the door, and we can see all of this out in the hallway.
Oh my gosh, it's so brilliantly constructed.
He turns back like once or twice to be like, one last thing. It's just to scare the crap out of us as an audience. It's just a very, very well blocked scene, and the kind of like tension and shifting positions that happen within it kind of echo the entire maneuvering and manipulation that happens throughout the entire film by these characters.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. That scene almost could act as a complete metaphor for the entire film. The way that she's kind of hidden in the shadows the whole time, with Walter Neff, our protagonist, if you will, insurance agent, kind of covering for her, and Edward G. Robinson, like so close, having the whole answer like right under his nose, but not being able to figure it out. And that element of her being in the shadows, I think, is really important, because this is probably our most our strongest example of femme fatale, because she's just so manipulative, and she's so, like you said, like her plot is so dark, and yet she's able to seduce him into doing literally anything that she says until he finally just has had enough. And it's not that he's even like a hardball detective like in our other movies. He's just an insurance agent who's traveling, like just literally doing his job at the beginning of this movie, not looking for trouble. He's not in a business where he's used to this kind of trouble, but he just gets roped into it and basically kind of falls into the same kind of position.
Yeah, no. And, I have to say, over the course of this movie, you don't really feel on the side of, our protagonist. You're kind of just like, you did this to yourself, buddy. And, of course, towards the end, you get this weird situation that I've actually seen a few times in a movie where you don't care about a character's fate, but you want them to achieve their goal. It's kind of like a doomed protagonist thing.
It's it's kind of like what we talked about with Psycho, when he pushes the car into the bog, and then the instant that it stops and he looks around, Hitchcock puts you right in Bates's shoes. Like, now you're on Bates's side and you want him to get away with everything. It's kind of like that. It's like, everything that's happening is terrible, but when Edward G. Robinson is so close to figuring it out, you're still like, your heart is beating twice as fast.
Yeah, that's true. But I do think that there is a gap between having a moment of sympathy for a villain and having a protagonist who is completely morally bankrupt, trying to redeem himself at the last moment.
That's true.
It's a you know what? That's a theory I will work on. If I was in 1960s France, I'm sure I'd write about it in a journal, but I'm not. So I'm just going to think about it and put it on a blog somewhere, because it's 2018 and that's how we do.
Yeah, but I will just kind of throw out this at the end that kind of ties in. There was a different ending that was planned for the film that Billy Wilder changed in the middle of shooting because he thought of a better one. Originally, we were going to see Walter Neff get arrested and literally go to the gas chamber, and it was going to end with him dying, getting the death penalty. And then while they were shooting, he thought of this better ending, which was to have him basically try and stumble and try and get away and like escape to Mexico or whatever. And he's just like, he can't do it, and he stumbles and he falls and he can't do his little trademark match lighting, and it just turns into this really sad kind of pathetic moment, as opposed to a kind of Schadenfreude justice ending.
Yeah, and you know what? To me personally, because I'm a weirdo, I am totally okay with knowing the end of a movie. And so in the sense of knowing, like, this character, you can feel he gives up to himself, knowing that he's doomed. He's just like, wow, I'm going to take you down with me. There's some kind of like almost relief in watching that happen. And you don't have to worry about whether or not he loses everything, his life, in the process, because he's already resigned to it.
And the other interesting thing is
weirdly enjoyable about that.
Yeah, and I think what really sells it is Edward G. Robinson's performance. And he kind of has this pitiable approach to him, where he's trying to take in this information that his friend for so long could do something so terrible, but he still like lights his match and everything, and he just kind of has this really sad moment, and I think he kind of sells the whole moment for me.
Oh yeah, no, that final moment is excellent, and we've spoiled it again.
All right, well, let's move on and spoil our last film.
Touch of Evil from 1958. In a masterful oneer, this film begins by following a car, which the audience knows to have a time bomb in the trunk, as it drives through a busy Mexican town and explodes very shortly after it crosses to the American side of the border. At the scene of the explosion, we are introduced to a cast of characters, including a newly married Mexican detective, Mike Vargas, his bride, Susan, and an American police captain named Hank Quinlan. As the police try to solve this crime involving a large Mexican mob, Mike Vargas and Hank Quinlan begin to diverge opinions on investigation techniques and police morality. Mike has to navigate the twists and turns of the case while also keeping his new bride safe. When Quinlan's partner becomes convinced of the improper way that Quinlan is operating, he and Mike have to find a way to stop him from going too far.
Oh my God, Jonathan, that opening shot!
I know, right, Alex? That oneer is amazing.
I mean, this movie's filled with oneers, like really good ones, but the opening shot is particularly impressive.
So for this whole movie, most of it takes place in this backlot set of a little Mexican town on the border, and we start with this shot has to be like 3 minutes long, right? He sets the timer for 3 minutes, and
yeah, right. You're given the time count at the start of the movie, which is brilliant.
And I think we get a full 3 minutes of following this car in and out of traffic, in and out of people, as the detective and his new wife are walking next to the car.
He's not a detective, is he? Isn't he like a DA?
I'm not sure what he is. He's some kind of cop. I'm not sure who any of them are, really.
He's like the Mexican equivalent of like not an investigator per se, but more like a district attorney. Like he kind of gets to pick and choose the cases that they pursue. And he works close enough with the cops that he can be analogous to it, but is still removed from the same cop system, so that he could be like across the line morally from Orson Welles, both like in terms of like on different sides of the border and different parts of the justice system, on different parts of the sanity scale, right. All sorts of things.
Yeah, so that's our Charlton Heston character, Mike Vargas, and so as this car is going on, like we're seeing them being right next to the car, and we kind of get the idea that they're going to be our protagonists because we're following them for some of the time. And it's just the most nerve-wracking opening to a movie ever. And then we get this really great introduction of all of our characters when all the detectives start showing up on the scene, and we just basically get a rundown of who everyone is. And then in the next scene, as Vargas's wife goes off to to get a motel room, she gets captured by the bad guys. So then we get a rundown of who the bad guys are. And it's just like a really efficient way to open your movie and just set the scene for everything. And we even get to kind of figure out like our characters' personalities, because as soon as we see Mike Vargas show up, he's got a new wife. So that's like kind of instantly sympathetic, and he just kind of he's Charlton Heston, so obviously still sympathetic. And then Orson Welles steps out of the car, and he is the greasiest, slimiest looking detective. And it honestly took me like 10 minutes to actually realize that Orson Welles was playing this character because it's just such a transformation.
Yeah. And that ain't a fat suit, y'all.
Yeah. I mean, we talked about this in the Orson Welles episode, so you can go back to that. But Orson Welles is like Christian Bale level master of disguise in these movies.
Yeah, he puts himself all over the map.
And it's like we watched him play fat characters like Falstaff and kind of Citizen Kane near the end and stuff. But those were kind of lovably fat characters, especially Falstaff. And this character is, like I said, just grimy, and he just looks seedy all the way through.
Yeah, no, this he's clearly got more than a touch of evil to him. But I feel like, and I don't know, you can give me your thoughts on this, of course, but I feel like the title is almost referring to everybody's perception of this character at the start of the movie. Like, maybe he's got a dark streak in him, but, like I was talking about earlier with Humphrey Bogart in the Maltese Falcon, it takes a criminal to catch a criminal. So it's very easy to excuse a touch of evil in a detective if it helps him catch evil.
And that's an idea that flows through this whole movie.
Yeah, but if that's true, and that is what's necessary, well, then that detective has to keep it in control. He has to keep it corralled, which is his own struggle. And if that's true, then Orson Welles' character has completely failed at that over the course of this movie. He just goes off the freaking... I mean, he was off the freaking rails by the start of the movie.
Yeah.
What's the best way to kill somebody, Jonathan? What have I always told you? You strangle them.
That is very useful information in case somebody gets strangled later on.
Yeah, right?
Like, why would you say that?
How'd your wife die again? Oh, she was strangled.
Oh my gosh, this guy was strangled. Who did it?
I wonder.
And definitely Vargas's wife.
Isn't his reason for... Yeah, right? Like, who's ever seen an episode of CSI? They immediately rule out a smaller person for strangling a bigger person. Right. Immediately. Like, come on. We all know that. But yeah, no, the hint dropping about Orson Welles strangling probably his wife and then probably other people in this movie is very high. Also, like, did they not have fingerprints back then? Why does he think that strangling is untraceable?
Yeah, I was thinking about fingerprints through all of these movies and several other film noirs that I watched this week, where it's like, okay, you're a detective. I think sometimes detectives kind of get a pass. I mean, not on necks, obviously, but if you're like in the crime scene and they find a detective's fingerprints, if you're working with the police in some capacity, you're like, okay, so they were here first or whatever. Yeah. But still, I was like, just put gloves on, jeez.
Yeah, right. Like, they make them. Definitely been used as a thing in movies before. But you know, whatever. Yeah. Let's also talk about real quick the fact that Charles Heston is playing a Hispanic character, and he plays he does a very good job in that role. That is a very good character. Yeah. And I couldn't have told you for the life of me that was Charles Heston.
I know, me too.
I would not have known. Somebody could have told me that, and I would have not believed them, and then looked it up twice in two separate locations to confirm. Yeah. Which by the way, is how you should always fact check everything. You know, don't just believe everything on your news feed. That's just your political awareness PSA for the day. And two, we've talked about this before. You know, what happens with whitewashed casting. And I am going to default not to us, Jonathan, but to the Cinephiles podcast on this one. They did an episode on Touch of Evil. I don't know if you've listened to it. Have you listened to it, Jonathan?
No, I haven't listened to that one. I listened to their epic Citizen Kane one, though.
They have a 4-hour, 2-part episode, something like that?
Yeah, it's really long.
Yeah, it's really good. Plugging other podcasts, that's what we do. That's the new Filmlings jingle. But on there they talk about this in depth, and one of the guys on the Cinephiles is Latino, so he has
moral authority.
And of course, he doesn't. One Latino doesn't speak for all Latinos, but he's got more right to talk about it than we do. So if you're curious to hear a conversation in depth, and by the way, his view in this movie is fairly positive. I think he even declares Charles Heston an honorary Hispanic by the end of the episode, which I don't know if there's a board for that. I
want to know what he would say then about Paul Newman from oh crud, I can't even remember the name of that movie now.
The Outrage.
The Outrage that we talked about way back in our Samurai and Sombreros episode.
That one might be a little less favorable just because he's playing a little more of a stereotypical character. But again, if you just showed that movie to somebody, you would have, unless you're a Paul Newman fanatic, you would have a hard time telling that it was Paul Newman.
Yeah. But
and that doesn't make it okay, but
right.
It is just interesting to talk about.
So the other interesting thing as far as the race deal in this movie is that race plays a part in the character dynamics because from the bat, Orson Welles' character Quinlan, I think the first line that he says is, well, what's the Mexican doing here? So we get these racist overtones like from the start, and we're obviously this crime takes place like right on the border. So we've got the Hispanic detective versus the American detectives, and there's definitely a race thing going on with the American detectives in particular, which makes Charlton Heston the underdog, giving him even more sympathy. But the interesting thing in this film is that we do have our hard-boiled detective, which is Orson Welles' character, and we have a contrasting moral detective. We have a foil for him in Charlton Heston. So like we're getting these different dynamics rather than just one detective that we follow through the whole movie. It's kind of these two detectives that at some point are fighting each other more than they're actually fighting the crime that they set out to discover.
Yeah, in the crime in this movie almost ends up being a MacGuffin, just kind of driving these two opposing forces to get towards each other in this really climactic way, as they kind of like draw people to their sides, back and forth. And then Janet Leigh, and I didn't realize this for the first time I watched this, she just kind of like goes off and has her own story that's deeply connected to the story happening between these two detectives,
but physically separate. Physically,
just very separate from the rest of them until very close to the end of the movie, when the frame up job happens, and that one is, oh boy, the when Quinlan's getting desperate and clearly crazier towards the end of the movie, he's like, yeah, I'll frame this guy for heroin trafficking and drug use and drugging his wife, and he doesn't like have that conscious thought. He's just like he just like off the cuff is essentially like, maybe it was heroin, and then he's like, you can see this light in his eyes, as bright as his eyes get anymore, and he just starts spinning this yarn right off the cuff, and suddenly he's framing him up, and everybody, all of his lackeys around him are lapping it up, and everybody's like, yeah, and suddenly he just weaves this thing into existence from nothing.
Because this is the big struggle through the film. I don't know if we've been very explicit about it, but the fact that Quinlan, Vargas starts to find out that Quinlan has been planting evidence in order to get convictions on basically like all of his cases throughout his career, and so we get this fight between corruption and doing the law the right way, even if it means that someone gets away sometimes. At least we haven't corrupted ourselves. And Quinlan's motive is we have to get the bad guy behind bars no matter what. Like, I know he did it, but if I can't prove it, then I'm just going to find a way to prove it. But Quinlan is also like on this really, really steep downward spiral just personally, and the more drunk he gets throughout the film, the less he cares about what his methods are or what anyone else cares about them, or how obvious he's being about his corruption.
Yeah. I love how at the start of the film everybody's like, oh yeah, he's so moral, he doesn't drink anymore.
Right.
Which is of course just setting it up for how bad things are going to go when he drinks over the course of the film. And I believe it's that he's framed or done frame ups on nearly all of his cases since his wife's died.
Yeah, there is a personal thing.
And of course, it's never explained explicitly what happened. But my guess is that he snapped at some point, killed his wife, strangled him, and then proceeded to just go off the rails, framing everybody after that. Like, I think killing his wife was his first frame job.
Yeah, I didn't think about it as him killing his wife, because I kind of got the sense that that would have kind of pushed him over the edge if his wife was murdered, maybe from someone who that he put away or whatever.
Oh no!
And then after that, he becomes more corrupt.
I 100% think he killed his wife.
I'll
mean,
have to watch
all
again
the
and
talk
pick
about
up
strangling, and then the fact that his wife was strangled. Like, no, I totally think that. Plus, like, he's just a sleazeball and easy to not like. He's interesting, but he is very easy to not like. And I also, can we blow the spoiler horn? Blow the spoiler horn, Jonathan.
Well, hang on. I was going to talk about our other detective character real quick, as long as we're on the corruption, because I think one of the most obvious character arcs throughout the film is Menzies, which is Quinlan's partner, who has been with him through all of these things, and Vargas starts to basically accuse him of also planting evidence, but Menzies has like this he plays innocent and like he doesn't know what he's talking about, and then actually he ends up realizing that Quinlan has been planting evidence, and he had a much more idealistic view of what was going on, and then he actually goes on to Vargas's side and helps him take Quinlan down in a really, really dramatic climax, which we're about to get to. But I think that character of Menzies is really interesting because we actually get to see him trying to do the right thing, realizing that he's on the wrong side, and then correcting his trajectory. Now you can blow the spoiler horn.
So yes, in this film with two dynamically opposed points of moral view, points of practical view, points of ethical view, just in terms of like character build and appearance, all of that stuff. These two characters have been fighting the entire movie, and I love that the climax happens on a bridge where they slowly essentially end up coming towards each other, not knowing it because one's creeping through the water and one's up on the bridge. But it is, I just find the entire setup for it fairly poetic. And of course, the tension building with the wiretap setup and Orson Welles suddenly turning on his partner and strangling him. Strangles a lot of people.
He shoots him.
Oh,
in
my
the
bad.
chest, yeah.
My bad. I don't know why I thought he strangled.
Classic worm's eye view from when he grabs him by the shirt and just basically point blank shoots him in the chest. But yeah, the other part of this whole climactic scene is Charlton Heston following them with the tape recorder, which is super important. And actually, Orson Welles talks about in This Is Orson Welles, the book by Peter Bogdanovich, how this whole setup of, because they're on like this oil field kind of thing. So there's all this machinery, and Vargas is trying to stay out of sight, but stay close enough that he can be in range to record all the audio that's going on, which is, again, one of those things that you can't really pull off today, but it works really well for making tension in this climax. And he's having to like climb ladders and go down all this machinery, and there's constantly like bars and stuff between him and them. And Wells talks about how this is it's a hostile environment for Vargas. It's not, he's having to exert himself way more than he should. It's not the kind of work that he's used to. Like, he's having to climb and he's having to dig down, and it's kind of like a metaphor for the work that he's having to do just to get to the bottom of this whole case.
Oh yeah, 100%. And of course, even just going into like filmmaking fundamentals, when Vargas is wiring up Menzies, there is a moment where there's like a quick set of feedback on the recorder, and you hear it spit back a line that you just heard. Which is important, and is so subtle. It's such a tiny moment at the start of the scene.
When Quinlan starts to hear the feedback from the tape recorder when he's under the bridge and it's echoing, but he's so plastered that he can't really put it all together.
Yeah. It's such a good setup payoff little beat there, just setting up those little technical things that otherwise would be hard to explain. Like, otherwise you just have suddenly this echoing feedback and you'd be like, what? That's weirdly convenient. But if you set it up, it's an established rule. And then, of course, there's feedback. There was already feedback.
And while we're on this climax scene, there's another thing that I want to talk about, which is going to go into this idea of all the trouble that this movie had during post-production, because there was a division of interest in the editing room between Orson Welles and the studio. Shocker for anyone who paid attention to our Orson Welles episode. But one of the things is this montage when Quinlan gets shot and then he falls back into the water, and the studio edits it one way, and then Orson Welles gives this really long note to the studio about the whole movie and all these edits that he wants. So if you go watch this movie on Netflix right now, you'll see a disclaimer at the beginning that says this has been re-edited to match that memo that Orson Welles set and kind of match his vision a little better. And one of the parts of that edit of that climax scene is that right before Quinlan stumbles and falls into the water is the shot of Vargas closing the tape recorder. And so it makes this kind of clacking sound, and then he falls. And the idea being kind of that the tape recorder is the thing that finally did him in after all of the terrible things that he's done. And there's a video essay that I'll link to that talks about the differences in the two different edits of the film, and things like the studio put titles over that opening oneer and classic film noir studio recorded music, whereas Wells wanted it to be clean without anything and with just like a diegetic sound, because there's no suspense if you see a truck with a bomb in it and there's a title on it. Like it's not going to blow up if you're watching it with a title on it. So it feels a lot safer than if you just have it clean and diegetic sound, because then the bomb could go off at any time. So things like that is really interesting. These little things that make the feel of the movie different. And that are one of the things that pushed Orson Welles into exile, because he fought it too hard.
Yeah. Big personality, that guy. Liked to fight with people. And before we wrap out discussion on on this film, Jonathan, we should talk about this particular film being the end of kind of the traditional conception of the noir, film noir period. I mean, this is a dark film, a very dark film. It's darker than the other two we talked about today. It is sleazier than the other two we talked about today. A lot more just really awful shit happens in this movie. I mean, Jonathan, there's a freaking gang rape scene in this movie.
Yeah,
that's
really
that's
hard.
not like a great thing to talk about, but it's just all part of like this is the deep dark noir parts of noir.
Yeah, and it's put especially into contrast given that Jenny Leigh's character, the only basically female character that we have in this film.
No, you have Marlena Dietrich.
Oh, that's true. But she's our protagonist female character who we're following throughout with Vargas, or I guess in contrast to Vargas. But, she's basically the only protagonist female character in the noir films that we looked at today, and in most noir films in general, who is not a manipulative character. She just literally has what's best for her husband in mind, and she's trying to be supportive and help him while also trying to stay safe, which is difficult because she's an easy target for getting to Vargas. And so I think she's a really interesting contrast, because we're rooting for her the whole time, and such terrible things happen to her throughout the film. And Jenny Leigh, just don't go to motels. Just don't. What are you doing?
She is. Yeah, I did think it was interesting that she chose to isolate herself so hard. I get why the instinct, especially after some of the creeping around early in the movie. But
the thing is, someone sent her to that motel, didn't they? Did Quinlan send her to that motel specifically? I think
somebody did. But anyway, somehow the Grandes found out about it. Because they own
that motel. No, the Grandes own that motel.
I don't know if they owned it. It was
that's what the shady, the really jittery guy says. He says that the Grandes owned it.
Oh, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if they owned it. It felt like they owned a lot of the town, but
yeah, that's true.
It did. I mean, it ended up being that there was nobody there, and then of course it gets stormed by the Grandes, and they go after her. It was unfortunate. Yeah. I was rooting for her to run away early in the movie back to
just on foot in the desert. Anywhere is better.
Yeah, but it was a rough movie. In a lot of respects.
That night manager was more jittery than Norman Bates, which is saying something.
Yeah, right. And she was not a femme fatale in this movie. She was a very different type of female character. She was very interesting.
She was more damsel in distress than femme fatale, honestly.
A little bit, but she was also very much actively trying to, not necessarily. Well, definitely for parts of the movie to save herself, but also to help Vargas take down Grande and then eventually Quinlan, even though by the end of the film she's pretty much incapacitated.
Yeah. It's so rough. But that's one of the things. I mean, this film comes out in 1958, so by this time we obviously have color. We've had color through most of these films, and then kind of the film industry moves on and takes elements of this classic period of film noir and moves them into a much different type of film as we go into the American New Wave, which starts to kick off in the 60s. So yeah, this is a very fitting kind of button on this era of film history, also on Orson Welles' life. So this is kind of wraps up our Orson Welles episode too. Not his life, but his Hollywood career. So yeah, let's move on into overall notes.
Yeah, these are dark movies, very dark, both in topic in terms of just like talking about the messed up crap that goes down in them. The morality of the characters that we see, whether they have a touch of evil or a whole lot of evil, like in Touch of Evil, where they have a whole lot of evil, not a touch of evil.
Or Double Indemnity, too.
Yeah, right?
There's not so much evil in Maltese Falcon as just power play.
Yeah, like manipulation and shady moves and being, just generally mean, bad people, but just dark. In fact, we kind of went down a scale of like least dark to darkest over the course of this podcast. Again, we totally planned that on purpose. But the literal darkness of these movies often translates into real darkness in the sense that they're typically shadowy. A lot of them happen almost majorly at night. If they do happen during the day, because all of these are set in LA or near LA. So all of that bright sunlight has to get filtered through for the day shots, these thick old blinds, so that you feel like you're in a dark location, typically filled up with smoke, cigarette smoke. It took me a while to realize, Jonathan, why everybody was always smoking in old movies. And it isn't just because they were all addicted to nicotine, although that was a thing. It was mostly to do with the fact that it made a good particle effect on screen and it looked good with light. And of course, there's the classic shot of the fedora shadow that you think of when you think of noir. There's the classic shot of the window slats falling across somebody's face.
Specifically their eyes.
All of the obfuscation that comes with the light. And the darkness and the shadiness and the hiding of characters' morals and motivations over the course of these movies is really, really interesting to watch. Just the visual style and the thematic content of these movies lines up so well.
Yeah, there's such a distinct visual look to all of these films, and we've talked about how that kind of translates into neo-noir, which we've looked at with like Old Boy and a couple other films so far, where neo-noir often uses shadows but also colors in very specific ways. But it starts here with these shadows and very specific placement of lights. This is not just kind of let's just use natural light and whatever as long as we can see the people. This is very specifically showing and hiding certain things, specifically in scenes where someone has to literally be hidden from another character, and obviously in a more kind of metaphorical sense, characters are always hidden from the other characters and very only small parts of them are illuminated. And again, this is coming from German Expressionism, where we saw like Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Nosferatu, where you're literally painting in your shadows on your set because in the 20s, you just have to flood your set with light in order to get the cameras to pick up anything. So they were literally thinking and placing their shadows exactly where they wanted to, whether it was realistic or not. Now we are using studio lighting and stuff like that, but still being just as intentional about where we're putting light and where we are not putting light. And it makes for just some really great films and really great shot composition that matches the tone and theme of the films.
Yeah, and looking forward, just this being such a stylized, particular, consciously affected form of cinema kind of meant big things for the movies to come. This is kind of one of the roots of larger genre cinema. Of course, you have monster movies from the 30s and you have gangster movies. But this is another one of those threads that leads to a lot of that stylization that would go into movies of the 60s and 70s, even leading up to today. Just the particular use of shadows and the extreme darkness, the tendency towards complex, more unique shots. All of that kind of moves forward. And of course, in particular, noir still exists today. It just exists in color as neo-noir, which I think we arbitrarily said a little while ago is kind of the line between film noir and neo-noir, is that neo-noir takes place in color. Just because you can actually have a little bit of brightness now around your neo-noir. I keep thinking about Old Boy.
Yeah, and I mean, you take the elements from film noir, you add them to the influence of Alfred Hitchcock, who we've talked extensively about on this podcast, which shares a lot of similar elements, but there's also thematic differences in the material that Hitchcock covered. And then you kind of move that into the film brat generation, and then you get the American New Wave, and basically any crime movie since then has elements of either film noir, Alfred Hitchcock, or some combination of the two, because they're just so influential.
Yeah. They were popular movies as well. Like, we should point that out. Like, they were very well received. There's a reason that so many famous directors dipped their toe in this pool. It seemed interesting. It seemed like it was full of style and choice, but also it was a good career decision to make a film noir at this point in time. Like, it was a good bet that you were going to make some money and raise your star with the studio by doing a good film noir.
And it kind of all came at the right time too, because this is kind of the post-war era where everyone's kind of got this really dark and somewhat depressed outlook on life because of all the horrors that have just happened. So this really dark theme material kind of had ample nourishment in this era.
Yeah, right. It was a good time for it. At least we didn't get depressed as the Italians.
Right. That's true.
Although, I mean, they had a right to. Their entire country had been invaded multiple times over, so
yeah. But instead of stealing bikes, we're just over here tripping each other out, deceiving each other, and killing each other.
Yes, good times.
But these movies, again, like, they're so dark, and the material has just so many twists and turns in it, and it's still during the Hays Code, which we've talked about. So you get this really interesting mix of showing some of the darkest material in Hollywood at that time, and even still nowadays to some extent, but having to conceal a large part of it, or at least kind of present it in something of a toned down way, but assuming that your audience is smart enough to figure out what is going on. And it just creates these really clever scripts and these really clever and expertly crafted scenes that just make these films so enjoyable.
All right, Jonathan. So let's talk about the role of women in film noir, which is typically a fairly what's the word I'm looking for? Pigeonholed one, where they typically get rolled into a femme fatale role. They typically end up being a femme fatale, which is a seductive, manipulative, dark, moralistically
if we're talking
woman.
archetypes, the temptress.
Yes, right. Like you'd learn as a kid, your archetypes. And it makes for interesting character dynamics. Of course, a lot of the characters in film noirs typically come out of a set of cards, and they are very set people. The villain, the detective, the hard-boiled detective, so on and so forth.
But the interesting thing is that, I mean, those character traits like the deception and the seduction and stuff seems to be what the morally ambiguous male characters are looking for. Like, there are so many times in these noir films where the men are not interested until the woman does something deceptive or devious, and then they're kind of totally on board, which is really an interesting dynamic because just everyone has this dark side to themselves that you're not really like in with anyone else until you've shown that you can lie or cheat or steal or kill to some extent.
Yeah, right. And everybody in these movies is pretty messed up. And it's kind of a grab back on each movie as to which one of these roles is going to be a more well-rounded character or not. I feel like the motivations or at least the character complexity in Double Indemnity is far richer than the character complexity in Maltese Falcon. At least talking about the role of femme fatale.
Yeah.
The woman in Maltese Falcon is just, greedy. She does a lot of interesting things, but she doesn't have a lot of character traits beyond that.
Yeah, she lies, and then she tries to seduce him, and then she lies again, and then he doesn't have it, and then she pouts, and so you're like, oh, okay.
Yeah. And then, of course, in Double Indemnity, our femme fatale is straight up freaking bonkers evil.
Yeah.
Like, she's got some weird, complex, mixed up emotions going in behind that for the reason why
she doesn't care if he's on her side or not. She'll use him as long as she can and get rid of him once she can't anymore.
Yeah, right. And her reasons for doing things are always so both screwed up and complex that she feels like a richer character than the character in Maltese
My question
Falcon.
is, why did she kill the mom?
The first mom?
Yeah, I guess because the dad had money at first.
She wanted to take her spot, yeah.
Yeah, because he had money and then she spent it all.
Yeah, she is stuck in a cycle of reaching for things and then realizing that isn't what's going to make her happy, and then reaching for the next thing, which is something a lot of us do, but it isn't a thing that, thankfully, most people don't kill over. So,
yeah, right. We don't seduce the first random guy that walks into our house
and then murder them.
Right. Yeah, but I mean, it's just these rich movies of these character studies where the audience is kind of like we were talking about a little bit earlier. We're kind of flipping back and forth on whose side are we supposed to be on, because often the most sympathetic character at the beginning of the film ends up being the least sympathetic by the end of the film, or vice versa. And it's just building this moral climate and intricate plot that allows us to flip sympathies so many times and keeps us engaged all the way through.
Yeah. And, nobody's going to change too much over the course of these movies. I feel like the one who changed the most is probably the insurance agent in Double Indemnity, but he's dead, so,
Yeah, or the partner in Touch of Evil.
Yes, definitely also changed, but also definitely dead. So the rule of thumb is if you change his character in a film noir movie, you die.
Also, just don't be in a film noir movie.
Yeah, also that, hopefully. But yeah, you get a bunch of interesting characters. You get a bunch of mixed up morals. You throw them in a box. You shake them up. You stir them around, and you've got a film noir.
Yep.
So, Jonathan, what are we talking about next time on the Filmworks podcast?
Yeah, let's talk about what we're talking about next time. But I won't introduce them. I will let our guest for next time introduce them, which is our good friend who you have heard for the last many episodes introducing all our films, Jason Harden. So what are we talking about next week, Jason?
Let me tell you, man, nothing says Halloween like Tim Burton, and we'll be talking about 3 Tim Burton films, each starring Johnny Depp. So we'll be discussing Edward Scissorhands from 1990, Sleepy Hollow from 1999, and Sweeney Todd from 2007, which just so happens to be my favorite of the Tim Burton films. I can't wait to discuss this with you guys. It's been an honor to do these narrations for y'all, and yeah, it's going to be a good time. I can't wait.
I'm excited, Jonathan. I've only seen one of the movies for next week.
Oh, really?
I am,
I'm going to guess
what?
that is Edward Scissorhands.
No, it's Sweeney Todd.
Oh, that's interesting.
And you know what? I didn't even know that there was a movie called Sleepy Hollow that Tim Burton did until 2 seconds ago, so I'm very excited.
Delightfully surprised.
Yes. Well, delightful might not be the right word. Maybe spookily surprised?
Spooky surprise.
Is that going to be the name of
I was going to say, that's a good episode title, so we'll hang on to that.
Well, that's about all the time we have for this episode.
If you have movie suggestions for us or just want to reach out, I can be found on Twitter at JSSatchel.
And I'm at Alex Garinger.
And I'm at the Blue Jay, 1994.
And to find links to things that we talked about today, you can view them on the blog at thefilmlinks.com.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next time.
All right, see ya.
Do you think like cheesy radio announcers, we should have like a button we can push that's just like spoilers?
I've actually thought about getting a some kind of sound effect that we could use, but I haven't taken the time to find one.
Don't actually keep that in there. That is a terrible noise. I also just love that I can make a really consistent like waveform on my audio whenever I do that.